This webinar is being recorded, but we are not live streaming. We will send you highlights of our discussion today. And of course, we welcome you to engage us through the chat box. And later, when we open the floor for the open forum, what will happen today is after the presentation of our guest speaker, we will have 3 commentators from Malaysia, the Philippines, and India to share their perspective on the input of our speaker. Then after our panel commentators, I will open the floor for open forum. Let me call on the resident representative of FES Manila joining us today to tell us about the program. Welcome, Vincent Satzel, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Macris. Hello, dear participants, dear partners, guests, dear FES colleagues and friends. Well, I'm very happy to see you all here today for our Friday afternoon session. And above all, I am pleased that so many partners from all over Asia have joined us, and even from the US. But that, I guess, that may also be due to our exciting topic and our speaker, whom I would like to extend a warm welcome to. Welcome, Marc Saxer. Marc is the Asia and Pacific Department head in FES, and I think he's no stranger to this circle here. Many of you have worked with him before, especially when it comes to transformative change making. On the basis of his many years of experience with which he has also made here in Asia in various ways, Marc has developed a practice-oriented method with TCM to initiate social changes beyond different living environments and different interests. At the beginning of this year, Marc published the book on the method. It is entitled Transformative Realismus, or Transformative Realism in English. With the book, Marc gives us the opportunity to delve deeper into the analysis of current systematic crises, and he makes suggestions on how we can overcome them. That means that transformative realism is more than just a theory of the TCM method. Transformative realism is a perspective to analyze the world, and it is an attitude to shape the world together in alliances and to change it for the better. In today's session, Marc will introduce us a little deeper into the construction of transformative realism. He will also look at the role of progressive forces in shaping society. As usual, I hope Marc will certainly confront us with our own blind spots, but he will also show us ways in which progressive forces can contribute to overcome the inertia of the status quo. A very particular example was the general election for the Bundestag 3 weeks ago in Germany. The Social Democratic Party of Germany emerged as the strongest force here after a long phase of crisis. I think some of the basic theses of Marc's analysis could certainly be confronted by the election result. I'm sure, Marc, you have a lot to say about that, but I hope, Marc, you won't go too deep into detail, because we are planning another event in November on the election analysis in Germany. And of course, we will be happy to share the date with all of you soon as it is finalized. After Marc's introduction of transformative realism, I am particularly looking forward to our joint discussion. Some of the premises that Marc assumes in his book apply predominantly in the context of Western democracies, as it seems to me. I am very much looking forward to further investigating and questioning this together. Therefore, thank you very much to Liew Chin Tong from the Democratic Action Party in Malaysia, to Percival Cendana from the Akbayan Citizens Action Party from the Philippines here, and of course to Sabina Dewan from JustJobs Network in India. The three of you will discuss with Marc what the analysis and the reception of transformative realism could look like in an Asian context. Thank you very much for being here with us today. Unfortunately, Munk Tsetsek Tser and Yamts from the Mongolian People's Party cannot be with us today. She has to meet important parliamentary obligations. We wish her all the best for that and hope to see her soon in another context. Well, now I have talked enough, but before we start, I would like to thank our friends from SOCDEM Asia for organizing this event today. In particular, Macris Caballeros, who thankfully take over the moderation. Thanks again to everyone. A very warm welcome, and I wish us an informative lecture and exciting discussion. Dear Macris, you have the floor. Mabuhay, thank you very much, and maraming salamat.
Now you have a book, SPD is in government. We are excited to hear from you, Marc, your perspective a year after. Welcome, Marc Saxer, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Macris and Vincent, for these friendly words. And good morning from Berlin. It's really nice to see all these familiar faces here in the chat, which is also a reminder that it's been too long that we've seen each other face to face. I'm really looking forward to a time when it's easier and better to travel again. Anyway, it's still good to discuss with you guys because obviously these are exciting times. In case you've been wondering what I was doing here in Berlin, cannot come to Asia, I wrote a book and we won the election. And this has not so much to do with each other as it sounds, but I think we are coming together on a new paradigm that is very, very helpful and is getting social democracy out of crisis where it's been stuck for the last 15 years. The title of the event today is called A New Politics. Not so sure if what I'm suggesting is a new politics, it's rather a back to the roots thinking. I think what I'm suggesting is a renaissance of really classical social democratic thinking. And I think that is a formula that will actually really bring us forward. Well, without much further ado, I will just share my screen now. And if you can give me a sign that you can see that, Macris?
We can see it, Marc, go ahead.
Wonderful. So what is this transformative realism? First of all, we have to talk about what that means, systemic crisis. What I do mean is that we have a series of crises in the West, but also globally, starting with the financial crisis, 2008, the Euro crisis, climate crisis, refugee crisis, democracy crisis, right-wing populist crisis, demographic crisis, and now the Corona crisis. And I claim that these crises are not isolated events, but they're all connected to each other, they reinforce each other, and they cannot be solved with the old recipes of the past. So we are really looking towards a paradigm shift that makes it necessary to come up with new thinking and as well end the old thinking of the neoliberal age. So I do claim that the neoliberal age after 4 decades is really coming to an end. In Germany, by the way, this is demonstrated by the fun fact that the liberals and the social democrats for the first time in 41 years actually talk about forming a government together after being in opposing camps for 4 decades, the entire neoliberal age, so to say. Still, it is interesting to see that besides all of the things that we have been criticizing for 4 decades coming to a close and collapsing down, the progressive camp is still not strong, but very contrary, it's divided, weak, and disoriented. So it cannot really benefit from the window of opportunity that the new paradigm is emerging. I think that has a lot to do with the way that how we do politics. So what is this new politics? What is this transformative realism, and what does it have to do with these multiple crises that are interconnected? I say that with the way that we have been trying to do politics, how we have understood governance over the last couple of years, we cannot step up and tackle this systemic crisis. There are basically, at least this is what Vincent's called a very German take on things. We have to see how we bring that into Asia right now. But it's a German book for a German audience, so I will have to basically start from here. What we had in those 16 years of a Merkel government, but that's also what you see in Brussels, that's also what you see in many Western countries, is a style of government or governance that I call technocratic incrementalism. What's that? It basically means that you look at all these crises around you, cut them into little pieces, into little problems, ask the experts what to do with it, and then try to solve it step by step by step, small step by small step, I would like to underline. That is actually something that is very popular in Germany. Still, a vast majority of Germans appreciate this kind of not too noisy, not too ideological, very pragmatic style of governance. The problem is that it's not enough to tackle crises that actually undermine the system in and by itself. So you cannot just wince and twist a few screws here and there and basically act as a big repair shop for the market. You have to be a little bit bolder than that, and you have to basically use a new technique of governance. Because there is so much frustration over this slow and timid kind of technocratic incrementalism, the progressive camp, by and large, has embraced an alternative vision of governance and politics, which I call moralist activism. That basically is frustrated with the state, which seems to be incapable and also unwilling to do what is necessary, but it also has lost all belief that the market can solve all the problems. So the focus here in the progressive camp, and we're talking social media movement, NGOs, activists, is on the individual. The idea is to say, if every one of us understands what the challenges are, and we change our behavior individually, in some, we will be able to solve these problems and move into a better world. The problem with this is that it has two blind spots. Number one, if you are living in a free country, if you have a constitution that actually gives you civil rights, then you have the right to say, I don't want that. I'm not doing it, right? And that's what we are seeing, basically, because, and that's, I think, an important part to be understood, what we're seeing, what is behind this onslaught of right-wing populism or populism in general, is that there is an overall frustration with the way that the elites, and I'm also saying it's not only the capitalist elites, also the educated young urban elites, many of them progressive activists, are acting over the last couple of years. So people have the feeling that they're being looked down upon, that their lifestyle is no longer appreciated, that they no longer matter, and they don't have a say in what is happening to the country. And a lot of important thinkers have observed that with the shift from an industrial economy towards a knowledge-based digital economy, you have certain classes that are emerging as the new social forces, but you also have losers of this phenomenon. And that is basically, so to say, in old terminology, a class struggle between an emerging, rising middle class and a declining middle class. And that is actually what explains all these culture wars and all this populism and so on. So what we need to understand as activists, as progressives, is that we should not participate in that, but basically stay clear of that, because if you have, for everyone who wants more climate change struggle, someone who denies the entire concept. If you have for everyone who would like to fight the pandemic with certain measures, someone who actually does not participate, in some, not much is happening. The second blind spot of moralist activism is that it is so focused on the individual that it has no appreciation for the concentrations of power in the sectors that really matter, the financial markets, the energy sector, and so on. There are very, very powerful interest groups in these sectors, and they will not go away or give you an inch if you change the behavior of the individuals. So we have to actually refocus on the political economy. We have to refocus on the balance of social forces. And that is basically the essence of transformative realism. This graph, many of you have seen before. That is basically at the beginning of all of my thinking when it comes to transformative change making and transformative realism, to really understand change, to really understand political outcomes as the outcome of societal struggles between those who want change and those who seek to uphold the status quo, for whatever reason, by the way, because they benefited from it materially, or maybe they're under the illusion that they benefit from it, which is a very powerful force. The issue is always the same. We have to focus on the balance of social forces, and we have to be able to win a struggle against resistance. The problem is that, number one, no single social group is big enough and strong enough to win this struggle. So automatically, we are faced with a challenge to build broad societal alliances that actually can mobilize the power resources that are needed to win this struggle. And this is a very difficult thing because social groups have diverging interests, identities, and ideologies, sometimes contrarian interests, identities, and ideologies. That's why it's so hard to build alliances, and it's even harder to keep them together. Those of you who have participated in the street politics in Asia over the last decade know that it is relatively, it's not easy, but it's easier to bring people together on a square and protest against something, but keeping this broad societal alliance together and struggle for something, that is a very hard thing to do. So if we are looking at the math of alliance building through a classical 19th century Marxist lens, so to say, it looked easier. It never was, by the way, but on paper it looked easier. You basically had a relatively simple structure of the industrial societies. You had a bourgeoisie and proletariat, and what social democracy figured out, if you can form an alliance between the educated functional elites in the state apparatus and in civil society and so on, and the salaried working classes, you actually have a very powerful social alliance that can actually shift the development path. That is 150 years of social democracy in a nutshell, right? The problem is that our societies look like this today. This is the post-industrial, knowledge-based, capitalist, plural society that we see in many Western countries. You don't even have to look into what exactly these milieus are. The point is that there are at least 9 of them, and they have very different ideological leanings. They have very different values and worldviews. They have very different hopes and fears. That makes it really difficult to form an alliance between them. And I'm not even inclined to use the word milieu anymore, because that somehow suggests that these milieus have a political party that represents them. That used to be the case in the past. That is also not the case anymore. These life worlds are heavily competed over between different political projects, different political parties, and they shift their colors quite drastically. This year is the outcome of the German elections in 2017. If I would do the same study today in 2021, the picture would look entirely different. The point is that I'm trying to make, it's very difficult to bring together this diverse set of what I call life worlds. Again, that is a social group that has a similar class structure, a similar position in the production process, similar hopes and dreams and fears and anxieties, similar values and worldviews. That's what I call a life world. And they are very diverse, and it's very difficult to form alliances between them. So how do we do it? I think all progressive projects are very much into alliance building. We have not been talking about much else in the last decade, but the approaches of how to do this and who you want to include and who you want to exclude are quite different. The old popular parties in the West, but also in you know, the Labour Party in Britain, Democratic Party in the US, the SPD and CDU Volkspartei in Germany, used in the 1990s and 2000s an approach which is catch-all. So the idea was to say, let's do a lot of research, polling, focus groups, and find a tailor-made political program for every demographic niche. So if you are a 47-year-old Protestant woman that lives in East Germany, I have a policy for you, right? And if you are a Rust Belt worker in a coal mine in West Germany, I have a policy for that, right? The problem is that this increasingly no longer works in this pluralist society, and it has a very technocratic flavor to it. It's very inauthentic and is easily beaten by populists. Think about Trump and Brexit. They had no policies whatsoever, still they won the election. So there is something missing, and that is speaking to the heart. So very popular in the West, but I do know from some of the friends in Asia that I've been discussing with in the last decade, also popular in Asia is the so-called intersectional alliance. Intersectional alliances try to bring together the minorities, people of color, queer people, for instance, together with the academic, highly educated middle classes. That makes powerful street politics. Think about the Women's March in the US. You can bring 1 million, 2 million people on the street. You make each and every one of the alliance partners more visible, and you can use street politics in order to get stuff done. The problem is twofold. Number one, identity politics is always zero-sum. What one group takes, another group loses. So the problem is that immediately you start pitching identity groups against each other. Against, if you think about the Women's March in the US, you remember that there was a huge internal fight over the relationship between Israel and Palestine. And it almost exploded the whole thing. It's very typical for intersectional alliances because the identity groups think so much in terms of their own hopes and fears, values and worldviews that it's easily clashing and therefore bringing down the entire alliance. Second, if you bring together groups that are very, very far from being hegemonic and bring in relatively little power resources except discourse, I find it hard to believe that something like this can become hegemonic. I think it's just too weak and too fragmented an alliance to hold up for the task at hand. Another approach, which is very, very popular, promoted by such thinkers as Chantal Mouffe or Nancy Fraser, is the left populist alliance. Here, the idea is to say, okay, do away with all the fancy postmodern politics. Let's refocus on the old labor task. Let's actually try to win the lower deprived third of the population, and let's focus on the working class and push forward their interests. There has been an upgrade when it comes to the platform, the ideology. Think about the Occupy movement, think about the Bernie Sanders campaign. You want to create an agonism between the 1% at the top and the 99% at the bottom. And this new frame, this new constellation about the top versus bottom actually allows you to mobilize across identity groups, milieus, and classes. The problem is that it has never really worked. There are a few such movements in Southern Europe, Podemos, for instance, in Spain, that you may argue that it has worked. Some of them a little bit dodgy when it comes to their normative basis, like the 5-star movement in Italy. But in Northern Europe and North America, it just never worked. And there are reasons for that in the political economy. I don't want to get into that right now, but you can actually have a look why it's not working. So transformative realism brings together an entirely different form of alliance. It actually tries to bring together all those who want to see an alternative future, all those who want change, and excludes the hardcore spoilers that want to prevent this change from happening. So the entire technique is bridge building between different life worlds, bridge building between different social groups. The idea is to bring, to build platforms that are broad enough that people and groups with different interests, ideologies, and identities can come together and join forces. It is, however, not embracing radical agendas, because that will create a narrow coalition that will not be able to mobilize the power resources needed to win the battle against the status quo. And it will trigger these reactionary counter revolts at the other side of the spectrum that I talked about earlier. I'd like to give you a very practical example how you see such a process at work. And that will be obviously a little bit controversial now for a German audience. But that's why we're here, right? So if you look at the field of climate policy, the climate political field, you will see that there are very strong social movements like Fridays for Future, but also Extinction Rebellion, that are pushing for a much more radical climate change agenda. They call it climate revolution. They call it climate state of emergency. In the electoral campaign of Germany, climate activists were actually staging a hunger strike in front of the Chancellery, the Prime Minister's house, and they wanted to force the hand of political parties to sign a contract with them that they would accept the framework and the program and the agenda of climate state of emergency. So the idea is to say the challenge out there is so great, so pressing, so enormous for the survival of the entire planet, of our entire species, that we can no longer wait for the slow-moving machinations of parliamentary democracy, but we actually have to bypass parliamentary democracies with all its rules and procedures and opposition rights and so on, and actually get the train rolling and finally get it done. The problem, as you can see in this graph, is that this kind of frame, this kind of narrative only speaks to a very narrow group of the German demographic, and it is precisely this critical, educated elite. Actually, I would claim that everyone in this call, including me, belongs to this life world. We all are critical, educated elite. Most of us even live in urban centers, and we have certain expectations, hopes, and fears. We have certain values and worldviews, and tackling climate change very radically usually belongs to that. But we do not, and we are not able to extend, mobilize beyond our own life world. A little bit what you call the committed bourgeoisie, committed citizens, which is the educated, older and more established elite, in Germany. Maybe they are committed to that, but other than that, it is not something that reaches more than 10% of the population. On the very contrary, it triggers counter reactions on the other side of the spectrum. We have, for instance, measured in Germany that the sales of SUVs, these big Hummer-like trucks, that are using much more climate unfriendly gasoline, gas gurglers, as you may call them, they went up. So despite of 4 or 5 years of massive mobilization on the streets, the entire media, the entire education sector caught on, and they're preaching the gospel of climate change, climate change, climate change. The discourse battle is long won. And yet the population, by and large, is exactly the opposite of what is being suggested, because they feel that we are looking down on their lifestyle and we are looking down on them, and they do not feel represented in this agenda. So a better way of actually getting the social and ecological transformation done is to take the center, the middle belly of the population with you into the transformation. And that has several dimensions. That actually means that you have to give material security and compensation, classical social democratic welfare politics, public services, but also if you think about coal miners or something, you simply have to reimburse them for being basically falling into nothingness. The right-wing populist hardcore concentration in East Germany it's not a coincidence that it's in the former brown coal mining areas, because these people have just been laid off, right? And they got no compensation whatsoever. There's no jobs. There's no hope for the future for them. So they're very, very bitter in actually fighting the status quo. So material compensation is one part of it. Second, you have to let people participate, have a say, and actually feel that their say means something in the way that we tackle these structural changes. So we have to have more democracy, especially on the communal level. And third, you have to give people a feeling that they are respected, that we're not rolling over them, that they are part of this community and they can have a sense of belonging. I say, I don't want to talk about the social democratic platform and campaign slogans too much, but I can already tell you that respect was the central claim. And it is one of these bridges that I've been talking about that actually work between queer and people of color, Rust Belt workers and people in East Germany, people that feel that they're looked down upon for their lifestyle, as well as people who feel left behind in the rapid automation game. Respect for you working on all of these life worlds, and it is one of these bridges that I actually talk about that are at the very core of transformative realism. So one of the platforms that actually works, that's obviously not from me, it's been around for a while, is the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal does exactly that. It wants to speed up transformation, but it wants to also take the vast part of the majority with them by compensating the losers. That's what you call just transition. And I think it is a pretty smart policy, and I think this is the way that we want to go. So taking this formula, taking this thinking, taking this approach to politics, we can apply the same formula everywhere. We want to speed up transformation. We want to get drastic, dramatic, disruptive reforms going by actually taking the majority, the middle of the society and the population with us. So, and to say you're making, you're co-opting your opponents, and you're making the social foundation, the social base for reform politics broader. So one of the fields where I try to apply this formula, and I think that may be interesting for our Asian friends, is the relationship between the market and the state. So in the Corona crisis, but also when it came to the evacuation from Kabul, Afghanistan, the German populations and all Western populations had to realize that after 40 years of neoliberal austerity, the capacity of the state is very weak. Like, we're not very good at crisis management anymore. We're not very good at regulating anymore. We're not very good at steering with industrial policy anymore. The state has been hollowed out. It's not very capable. Frankly speaking, civil servants are not the top notch anymore. If you are young and talented, you will go into the private sector. You will not go for a very low salary into the state sector. all of that has weakened the state. And yet, when the shit hits the fan, people turn to the state and not the market to find the solutions. So basically, there has been a broad acceptance that the things cannot go on like they were, that drastic changes have to come. And people were looking for a leader that can act and implement that competently, but also with social balance. That was the decisive factor in the German election. And that has a lot to do with a new relationship between market and state. So a lot has been written about this, and everyone can have an opinion about that. But the very point of transformative realism is, I always say, as an analyst, my own opinion I don't care for, right? Basically, what works and doesn't work is not functional. It is, what is the platform that as many life worlds as possible can state brings back world-class public services at the peripheries. It actually uses industrial policy, but also monopoly busting in order to steer the private sector. It is it invests very heavily in research and development and lays the infrastructure for future growth. So it's a neo-Keynesian, pretty active, investing, but also capable state. That is complementary to the hopes and fears, to the values and worldviews of a lot of these life worlds that you can see in the middle. The problem is that this is not something that the educated middle classes feel very comfortable with, especially the critical educated elite, people like us, get a little bit careful when it comes to this whole idea of security and the nation state. So that's something that under progressives seems not the right way to go. When it comes to the committed bourgeoisie, the committed citizenry, there's a lot of entrepreneurs in this life world. They don't like this whole idea of the state steering the economy, right? So they're very committed to free markets. So that means there is a limit of how much state you can do. And there is no going back to the 1960s model of, well, difficult to translate from German. I call it commando state. We're talking about a free market economy, but in the 1960s, when you look at basically the US and West Germany, but also Japan, there was much more state action than there used to be in the neoliberal age later. So I'm not suggesting to go back to that. I'm suggesting to be something more with a soft touch. I'm trying to suggest something that is complementary to the civil society and the private sector, but yet more active than what we had. The interesting thing is that this will be able to be complementary, is acceptable and even desirable by many life worlds, but not by all of them. So the idea of transformative realism is not to, catch all. It's not to say whatever pleases. It's not to say whatever we find in the polls could be acceptable or even attractive, but you also want to exclude certain life worlds and their hopes and fears and values and worldviews. So of course that has nothing to do with the right-wing populist idea of closing the borders and basically building a police state, but it's also not compatible with this critical educated elite idea of open borders and defunding the police. On the very contrary, there's a very emphasis on providing security for the people. If you lose the middle class because it's afraid, everything's possible. And I think no one understands that better than our friends on the Philippines. It's a very, very dangerous game to play to fumble with the idea of providing security for the middle class. It has nothing to do with the Wild West dreams of neoliberal new round of austerity and now let the market take over because the state is bankrupt. But it's also not the redistributional state that the hard left wants. The emphasis will not be on redistribution. The emphasis will be on transformation. And that's exactly how the Germans voted. I don't know if you realize that, but we have a left-wing socialist party in Germany, which lost 50% of its vote and almost fell out of parliament. And now we are basically being forced to form a coalition that we call a traffic light, which actually brings together Social Democrats, Greens, and the Liberals. A combination that is not easy to imagine on paper because there are many contradictions. What reunites all of these parties and the reason why all the other parties, the right-wing populists, the conservatives, as well as the left-wing lost, is that it was a choice between those who would actually want to do something and overcome the crisis and modernize the society, and those who wanted to stop it for some reason. So those who wanted to stop it, who either wanted to go into an imaginary past, like the right-wing populists, or basically try to water down and slow down reforms like the conservatives, were punished by the voters. And those of them who wanted to speed up transformation actually were rewarded by the voters. So that's the Greens and the Liberals. And social democracy, I believe, was elected because it promised to speed up transformation, but also bring the right social balance and the right political stability to it so the whole thing doesn't explode. That is the lesson learned from the German election, and that is precisely in line with the thinking of transformative realism to build a vast block of life worlds in the center of the polity and bring them into the transformation, but exclude the radical agendas of the margins so that you can actually come together on the same platform. This is where I stop here, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion, and especially in bringing these thoughts into an Asian context. Thank you very much.
Let me introduce our commentators. Welcome, Comrade Liew Chin Tong, former Deputy Defense Minister of the Pakatan Harapan government and member of the National Executive Board of the Democratic Action Party. Welcome, Comrade Percival Cendana, former party leader of Akbayan Citizens Action Party in the Philippines, and now our candidate in Parliament. Welcome, Sabina Dewan, our friend from India, who is the President and the Chief Executive of JustJobs Network based in New Delhi and Washington, D.C. I will have 2 rounds of questions for our panel commentators. But after each round, I will, of course, give the mic to Marc Saxer to respond after each round. And each speaker will have 5 minutes for us to hear your perspective on what Marc has discussed a few minutes ago. For our first round, I will begin with Comrade Tong, then with Comrade Percy, and then with our friend Sabine. How relevant is transformative realism as we go through major systemic upheavals during this crisis? And what do you think are agreeable points? And what do you think are contentious points from Marc's presentation? Comrade Chin Tong, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Marc, and also to all the other panelists and friends who are here this afternoon. The afternoon in Malaysia, I think morning elsewhere, and also evening elsewhere. I would just like to make a few points. First, I like what Marc talks about when Marc talks about respect. I've been saying that there needs to be a politics that based on empathy. There has been too much confrontation. There has been too much, especially when it comes to identity politics. And in our context, in the Malaysian context, say my party has been fighting for meritocracy, meritocracy versus a state that that had actually promoted ethnic or race-based what they call favoritism to a certain extent, but also affirmative action at better times when it started. The idea is that I think we need to break the wall of identity politics, and also remove this idea that meritocracy is the only way to go. I think there is a need to meritocracy has a very strong sense of self-righteousness, and this is difficult to deal with. I think we need to somehow say, particularly for DAP, for Democratic Action Party, there is a need to bring the party to see that there are many victims of capitalism, there are many victims of the system, and we need to bring everyone together through this idea of either respect or empathy, so that we empathize with those who are in need, and also those who are looking for upward social mobility. I think how to do it is difficult, but the idea that meritocracy is the ruling idea, I think that is something that we will have to move away from. We need to start thinking about how to deal with inequality. We need to start thinking about how to deal with climate. We need to think about democracy. Now, democracy is a fragile commodity. Democracy is very fragile especially in Asia, in the Philippines, in Malaysia, in other parts of Asia. How do we entrench democracy? And also, how do we, say, for example, in the context of Malaysia, how do we strike a balance between centralization and devolution? More power to the states or authorities at a lower level, and how to ensure that there's no corruption at all levels of government. How to ensure participatory governing, which is difficult. Even when we were in government, it was difficult to get more participation in policy making, and how to deal with the questions of the health crisis, to deal with the questions of security. We will face with a lot more security challenges, both in our region and also elsewhere. And particularly in our region, there's either a crisis in Northeast Asia or in the South China Sea, where the Philippines, Malaysia, and other countries will be affected. So we will have to think about national security a lot more compared to the last 30 years. The last 30 years since the fall of Berlin Wall has been relatively peaceful, both in Europe and also in Asia. But in the next 30 years, perhaps we will have to spend a lot more on security, and we may have to think of security in a multifaceted way. Malaysia used to be very rural, but we are now highly urban. We need to think about cyber, we need to think about urban warfare, we need to think about some of these issues, which required us to rethink the way we conceive the state. We will also have to deal with the questions of health crisis. And I think with some of this recent development in China, and also Joe Biden's 3.5 trillion proposal, especially on care economy, the question of democracy, demography, the question of demography is being brought forward. The question of demography is being brought to the center in China, in some of this crackdown on tuition center, on some of this crackdown on cost of living in China is very much related to Xi Jinping's or the Chinese government's concern about declining birth rate and the struggles that middle class family faces in order to raise a family, in order to have kids. I think the same goes to the United States, and therefore it brings the questions of care economy to the front. How do we ensure that we create jobs in all sectors, including creating paid job in the care economy, in terms of childcare, aged care, dealing with what they call declining birth rate, but also dealing with an aging society. Now, these are the challenges that we will have to face, and I like what Marc has presented. My only concern is how to balance between, well, Marx is not trying to be a catch-all party, but you are trying to catch all to a certain extent. There is always difficult to balance between catching all and providing a, I mean, much as Marx talks about providing a transformative platform for all, how do you, where do you cut? There must, we'll still have to make a stand. We will still have to say that there are certain people who do not belong to this coalition. Who are the people that do not belong to this coalition? How do we deal with them? And how do we actually ensure that our own elements, our conventional elements, are not radicalized, and ask for more radical solutions? I think these are questions that are on my mind. Perhaps Marc can deal with later. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Marc.
My deepest appreciation for the presentation of Marc this afternoon. And I think it has come in the most opportune moment, as the pandemic, the corona crisis, has really exposed and further dramatized the weaknesses of the status quo. And also it has exacerbated inequalities. So perhaps my first reflection after the presentation of Marc is because the pandemic has exacerbated inequalities, and yet there is this assertion that there might be need to exclude radical agenda in the radical agenda of the margins. How do we negotiate that terrain? The terrain of this exacerbated inequalities, and then the agenda of those in the margins. So that would be an interesting conversation perhaps later in the afternoon as we discuss transformative realism. So let me begin this afternoon's reflection with one of the more poignant points that was made mention by Marc on that neoliberalism is coming to an end, yet progressives are divided, weak, and disoriented. And I preface my reflection with the earlier point about how the pandemic exacerbated inequalities, how it has further exposed the weaknesses of the status quo. And this should have been the perfect time for progressives to rise to the occasion and propose our alternatives. And yet we are in that position where we are divided, weak, and disoriented. So I'm not sure if this is an experience being shared by other comrades and colleagues in the region, but this is quite the case in the Philippines right now. Thank you, Marc, for emphasizing that transformative realism is actually a renaissance of social democratic thinking and practices. And it's no accident that I'm wearing a shirt shared or given to me by young colleagues from the PMT a few years ago when I was part of the training as a resource person to inspire that conversation this afternoon. So this new thinking has emphasized a point that I think is often lost to us as progressives, and that is to position our alternatives in such a way wherein the objective is, as mentioned by Marc, to overpower resistance of the status quo, because we have always positioned ourselves as the resistance. And I think what Marc has showed us this afternoon is we can frame it the other way by looking at our alternative and then positioning the status quo as also the resistance to our alternative. So that's a very interesting point. What I also find very interesting now is that this transformative realism as a new way of thinking and practice is very instructive during a time wherein there is great plurality around the world, especially in areas where there is a right-wing resurgence and right-wing domination. So I think one question that I would like to ask also this afternoon as a critical point of reflection would be, in this polarized situation, you've mentioned that compromise is a hard sell, and yet compromise is a necessity. So how do we negotiate, given the context of what I've mentioned as exacerbated inequalities a while ago? I appreciate very much the call for a reframing of how we do our alliance and coalition building, but taking from the observation of the German experience in relation to the experiences in the Philippines, my initial gut feel is that a stable political party system is a prerequisite for that kind of a practice. So Mark, I think the other point that I would like to raise also, and perhaps you can elucidate on, is how would this kind of coalition building work in systems like in the Philippines, where the political party system is, if not totally absent, quite wobbly and obfuscated. And the last point that I would like to emphasize this afternoon for this round would be if transformative realism is a practice of addition instead of the usual practice of subtraction or division, and you've mentioned the target is at least 50% of the forces involved, what is the guidepost that could be used in incorporating various life worlds into the fold? I'm asking for a guidepost because I think the experience in Germany would be very helpful as we navigate through a national elections come 2022 in the Philippines, wherein there's a need really to mobilize those who are striving to end the current status quo and also provide new alternatives without losing of the more structural and fundamental reforms that we are pushing for as social democrats. So that would be all for in the meantime, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, Percy. Again, I will repeat the question to Mark, but thank you for pointing reframing of positioning in the political field to reposition the status quo as also resistance to the agenda of transformation. Let me call on Sabina Dewan. Please, you have the floor.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to SOCDEM Asia and to FES for the invitation to be here today, and to the chair, Macris. You're extremely articulate in capturing the main messages of the discussion, and it's a privilege to listen to you and, of course, Marc Saxer. Congratulations on the book. We've interacted on it several times. And every time I hear you present, I come up with new questions I want to ask you, because it is just such an important and stimulating part of the discourse today. So thank you for presenting us with this opportunity to think about the how as much as the what. I think, we are in an unprecedented time right now. And in some ways, I think every generation thinks that their time is unprecedented. But I think the kinds of existential crises we are facing today and the confluence of different crises really do make this a unique time in history. And what do I mean by the confluence of crises? I think one, of course, there are big transformations like technological advancement. Now we've got the pandemic, climate change, that are really upending the way that we all live and work, and our own individual abilities to adapt to this kind of change. The second category of crises, as it were, is the actual polarization of both the political as well as the media environment, right? And I think that that's a really important aspect that we often don't talk about enough, which is, we are in some ways living in a post-truth era with the current media environment. So that would be like a second sort of category of challenges that we're confronting these days. And the third is something that I think Marc has very clearly spoken about, as have the other colleagues on the panel, about the inability of government and governance institutions to keep up with the pace and scale and dynamics of these crises that we are experiencing today. So all of this as a sort of as a way to say that clearly clearly a new paradigm is required. And Marc's book, Transformative Realism, I think does exactly that. It presents us with a how-to plan that in some ways can help revitalize progressivism with this approach that is much more aligned to the changing environment today. And as Marc said himself, to bridge building that kind of addresses the how aspect of many of these crises. Now, of course, every time I hear Marc present, as I said, I come up with more questions that I want to ask you. So I'm actually going to take the rest of my time to present you with some of my questions that come to mind. And one is that this approach, as I said, talks about the how, but do we also need to consider the what, right? Comrade Tong and Percy both spoke about, Comrade Tong spoke about the need to move beyond meritocracy, about the kinds of challenges we're confronting with demographic change and job creation. And Comrade Percy spoke about the weaknesses of progressivism. I think there is a fundamental question here that, yes, we need to build bridges and expand social alliances such that we can adjust to the pace and scale of change that's occurring today. But at the same time, do we as progressives first also need to consider what a new agenda for 21st century change looks like? And do we need to actually fundamentally question some of our own assumptions that no longer hold today? Don't get me wrong, I don't want to be a spoiler and be cast out of this discussion. I am truly a progressive at heart, but I think that a part of the weakness of progressivism that we are experiencing is also that more and more of our agenda has been co-opted by the right, and that we are lacking for ideas on how to resolve some of the challenges that are confronting economies and societies today. So that's one. The second is, Marc, you spoke about sort of the problems with technocratic incrementalism. And, I wonder if the notion that we can have some kind of a Big Bang reform is a little bit too optimistic. Isn't all change incremental? In some ways, I think we have several factors that influence the ability to make change. So even if we have a large alliance between, we build bridges and we create the social alliance to affect change, which I agree is the absolute right approach and it is something that should be implemented. But is it going too far to expect that that will necessarily lead to Big Bang change and not incremental change? There's macroeconomic factors, political and other economic factors, socio-cultural factors that all have to, that all affect the ability to institute change. So isn't all change incremental? And the third is something that has already come up, and maybe it's also for us to reflect on the answer to the third question, but it's of course the applicability of this new paradigm to the developing world, and not just Asia, but other parts of the world that are developing, where we have very, very heterogeneous populations, where we have very heterogeneous economies with informality, with different ethnic groups, coupled with weak institutions. Does broadening the social base for instituting change provide a more inclusive approach to dealing with heterogeneous populations? Perhaps it does, in which case I think your book actually has even more applicability to the developing world than perhaps in Germany. But on the other hand, I think it also poses questions about how do you build this kind of a broad-based social alliance in economies and societies and cultures that are very heterogeneous. So I will stop there because I think I've asked a lot of questions. But thank you again for a very, very stimulating discussion, and also providing us with a new approach, a new paradigm. I think a lot of people talk about the problems, and very few people actually go into providing a plan of action and a roadmap. And I think you've done exactly that. So I look forward to continuing to engage with you on these issues. Thank you.
Marc, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. Obviously, challenging questions, and I think this will be a very, very interesting debate. Maybe let me start with the big one first. This whole idea. So, how much do we have to reposition ourselves in the political field, and how much of our agenda do we have to give up on that? That's actually absolutely not the idea of transformative realism. The idea, and as you see, I put together two complicated words here, transformative and realism, right? Transformative is supposed to indicate that you actually speed up, become bolder with your reform agenda. And realism does not mean compromise everything that you hold dear away. It actually means focus on the balance of social forces. Whatever you do, you have to do it in a strategic way by positioning yourself in the political field and always understand what the life worlds want. So I had the amazing advantage that all the groundwork of actually doing the research on these life worlds have done by someone else, and I could just elaborate on that. That means if you want to try out the approach of transformative realism in your societies, you need a similar understanding of the political field of your life world, so to say. I cannot give that to you. That is sociological work that has to be done. But everything starts from there. So to go to all the questions, first, Marcus, you said that what is this renaissance of social democracy and in theory and practice. I just want to emphasize again that in my understanding, social democracy was always the core actor in shaping transformation. This is actually what we also have done with the last industrial revolution, basically bringing together the social forces then in a big social compromise and building the social contract that actually was able to pacify the industrial societies, for instance, through collective bargaining and the welfare state. And what we have to do right now with the next transformation is exactly the same monumentous task of trying to build a new social compromise onto which we can build a new order for this new transformation. So it's really going back to the roots of what we do best, and that is stabilizing the transformation through political compromise between classes, life worlds, and milieus. Chin Tong's interesting points. Well, first of all, I completely agree with you that Malaysia's scourge, Malaysia's plague, so to say, is identity politics. And you will never have the opportunity that we had in Germany, that both popular parties understood that identity politics is toxic for them and try to not talk about it at all. I think the Malay dominant parties will never do you that favor. What may be helpful is, again, and I think you already picked up on that, to try to bring together your warring tribes, to bring together as many identity tribes as possible through a bridge along the y-axis of identity, culture, and recognition. And I think the term respect works extremely well in the German context. It may be worthwhile trying to think about a similar idea in the Malaysian context, how you can actually express that, and this may be a false accusation, doesn't matter. In politics, false accusations stick, that you're looking down onto someone, that you are actually trying to take away their privilege, that you try to change their way of life, that you disrespect basically parts of the population, and convey the message that that's exactly what we're not doing. We would like to recognize you, respect you. It is a good bridge. Maybe it can be used in Malaysia as well. You emphasized the agenda of Joe Biden. Let me just reiterate that. I think it's extremely important to understand what is going on in the United States, because this is where the new paradigms are set. Let's not fool ourselves. What happens in the US will happen sooner or later in at least half of the world, certainly in Europe. And if we look at what he's doing with this multi-trillion-dollar investment project, which is called Build Back Better, that is the end of neoliberalism and the beginning of a neo-Keynesian economic development paradigm. I cannot even overstate the importance of that. And I think this is what is reformatting the political field in all Western democracies and will have huge implications on how the global economy is constructed. Percival and you, and I think Sabina as well, all asked the question, so what is this tension between catch all, try to be as broad as possible, but at the same time mobilize the base, not, basically betray the values and the core agenda that we all stand on, and basically where you cut the fringes. I mean, if you want, I can later show you those 5 platforms that I've constructed. It's always the same. You basically try to cater to 50+X% in the center of the voter basis of the population, and you always exclude the fringes. It's always the same formula, but it is different how that works on every political field: climate, international politics, economic politics, and jobs. Integration, migration, and social cohesion. You have to come up with different platforms and exclude different rivalry political projects. Like I said, we can go into that, but I think there is a more fundamental question behind it. One of the things that I have learned in Thailand when I was the country director there, and some of my early writings were translated into Thai, that the Thais felt extremely uncomfortable with the word compromise. Because if you translate that into Thai, it means something like defeat, right? And that's obviously not what I'm talking about here. In German, we have a similar word, which is called formula compromise, which means the lowest common denominator between positions, which amounts to almost nothing. This is not what I'm trying to suggest here with transformative realism. It is about actually building a common project. It's building a common platform for different life worlds where they can all assemble. So that is, first of all, a wake-up call to progressive comrades, progressive activists from this left top corner, basically ourselves, that we cannot just simply impose our values and worldviews, our attitudes and manner of speaking onto the society, but we have to go back to the drawing board and test each and every policy if it actually is possible to build a broad alliance around it or not. If you want, and the time allows, I would like to elaborate that later on the example of a universal basic income, which is a favorite amongst progressives, and I believe it will not work. It will not work through the lens of transformative realism. Maybe I can elaborate on that later. Sabina said that we have these vast changes in the media landscape, and that is something that is actually wind into our face. It's quite interesting to observe the German elections. We have a couple of Germans in the audience. I don't know how you read the situation, but I would say that this time, for the first time in a long time, the media, both the old media as well as new media, social media, did not matter. They all had the same opinion. They all wanted a coalition between the Greens and the CDU, and they all declared social democracy dead. None of them saw the renaissance, the resurgence of the SPD coming. And they still, after the election, could not believe it, right? So they have completely misunderstood the political mood. And it also seems they have lost their guidance for the population. The people just voted what they wanted and didn't care what the media said. That is quite an interesting thing. incrementalism isn't all change incremental. Well, governance is always incremental, and I think that cannot change because things are difficult and you have to find the right policy mix, and actually, the technique of implementing policies is incremental, and obviously I do not want to change that. The problem is the strategic thinking. I think that, and that may be a very German thing right now, I'm not sure if that translates into other societies. But if you talk to policymakers, also social democrats, say 5 years ago, 10 years ago, they have a very clear understanding of what's possible within the status quo and what not. What political forces in the parliament, but also what social forces in the society would be able to agree upon and what not. And that limited their imagination of the possible to such a narrow set of policies that the whole thing was so timid and so slow and so small, that it just did not actually match the challenges that are out there. And vast parts of the German population, for different reasons, no longer wanted to endorse this kind of little step by little step timid politics, right? So you basically had a groundswell of people, both young and frustrated for different reasons, that demand a bolder politics. So what I'm trying to say is, let's be more imaginative what alternative social formation, what alternative future is possible, and deduct from there what's possible, and not so much limited by the boundaries of the status quo, because transformation is all about overcoming the status quo. And the last point is that how does that match up with Asia's heterogeneous populations? I think you're very right, Sabina, that I think this may be a strong point in the book, which is, by the way, translated into English as we speak. Sorry, that takes so long. But I think, the whole point why Transformative Realism was written is to make the point that the Western society become more heterogeneous, more plural, more fragmented, more polarized, right? And that's why the alliance building gets more complicated, and the public discourse gets more toxic, and it's so difficult to agree on anything. So I think that that is basically something that we're very much in line with, to operate politically within very fragmented society with very different life worlds, and how to bring them together. Again, like I said in the beginning, you need a little bit of sociological research and groundwork that can actually measure up the life worlds in your country, in your society, and build it from there. What you cannot do is copy and paste the proposals I made for the German society. By definition, that will fail, right? Because it is very much catered to the life worlds in Germany that has to do with history and culture, that has to do with anxieties and hopes, that has to do with religion and demography and so on. And you cannot just copy and paste from one society to the other. But what you can do is imitate and copy the technique. You basically, by looking at the life worlds of your society, have a very clear understanding what they want and how you can bring them together, and therefore build platforms that match your society. That's what I wanted to say with Transformative Realism. The answers that I give them specifically for the German society, you cannot copy and paste.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chair. I was hoping that you wouldn't do that, although I had a feeling that you would. But so let me try to answer your question, and also pick up on a couple of things that Marc mentioned. And then I have one more question for him. But first, I think I really appreciated Marc's insights on how governance and implementation of change is always essentially incremental, but, and I'm rephrasing here, but the visioning process doesn't have to be. And I think that really actually puts, really taps into the pulse of what I think has been one of the weaknesses of progressivism over the last several years has been the inability to provide a new vision for a 21st century economy and the kind of changes that are happening all around us. And so, I think that I still hold that the starting point is for us as progressives to figure out where we need to update our agendas, number one, and then to craft a vision that is bold, that is broad enough to encompass the variety of social groupings that we would like to bring under this umbrella in order to be able to institute change, but with the understanding and messaging around the fact that essentially change is an incremental process. So that's number one. In terms of envisioning a transformative platform for change, I think, again, I having worked in this area and having given a lot of thought to why we witnessed, especially in the last few years, this kind of paradigm shift, this pendulum that kind of swung to the right. And now we're gradually, hopefully seeing, with the election in the US and then in Germany and in Norway, the return of more progressive forces. I think there is a kind of honesty that we need to institute in our own political thinking about how the environment has changed. If I look at the area of jobs and labor markets in particular, I think we have to actually acknowledge, for example, and I'm using this as an example, that there is growing precarity in the labor market, right? That there is this reality that, that formal sector jobs are becoming more and more insecure. And that the idea that we can I'm just using what I think is a fundamental progressive belief that we have to formalize the informal. But how do we do that when the formal sector itself is becoming more and more precarious, right? So we have to fundamentally start to question, is the old conventional idea of like formalizing the informal the right paradigm behind which we should be crafting our agendas? Or do we need to think of alternative ways of protecting, workers? Do we need to keep fighting for, for social protection in the formal sector when we know that large shares of our economies are informal and there's a delinking of employment and social security, right? So I'm trying to present examples from the field that I know best of how some of our conventional ideas, maybe another powerful one is, it is indisputable that trade unions are fundamental in the continued fight for justice. But there is something to be considered that trade unions have been losing support over the last several years. And we need to ask the hard questions as progressives for why some of these trends, why are we sticking to the status quo in terms of our beliefs? So I'm not questioning that trade unions are important, but do we need to think about new models of trade unionism that can reinvigorate the movement, right? And I think those kinds of fundamental questions are, is how I would envision a transformative platform for change, starting with questioning the kinds of assumptions that progressivism has been based on for a very long time that are now being cast into question, which I think also propelled the shift to the right. And then I'll just end with this. So where I end up on this, Mark, with my third point, which is a question for you, is really about the 50% plus X, and how you mentioned that we have to form coalitions. We'll be forming different coalitions along different topics. So the climate change coalition might be different from the jobs coalition. But my question is that these issues are so deeply integrated that how do you kind of have separate coalitions? isn't one of the problems of a polarized environment precisely the fact that the climate activists don't actually talk to the job activists that don't actually talk, you know? So it's a very operational question that I'd like to end on. But thank you so much for this opportunity, and I look forward to hearing the other panelists now. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Macris. In preparation for this session this afternoon, I read some of the summaries of the book and some of the articles written by Marc. And I found it very interesting that in one of the pieces he wrote, he made mention that we can only make the great transformation happen by convincing a majority of society. And this leads me back to a very fundamental value that we have constantly advocated for, worked for, and aspired for. That is, as young activists, we're always told to capture imagination. And I think with transformative realism, we are again reminded of that important task of progressive, of capturing imagination. But this time, that the capturing of imagination has been sort of quantified, because it has been clearly outlined that you need at least 50% of those in the various life worlds in order to do that. And what I found very instructive in Marc's proposition and how he documented this practice that has won the election in Germany, and now that has been developed into a worldview and a way of framing our actions, is that it has given emphasis to the recognition of the diversity of life worlds. And I think as progressives, that's one thing that we have to learn, how to value and appreciate these life worlds from the lens of what was mentioned a while ago about aspirations, hopes, and fears. As activists, we tend to be very rational and stay away from these very valid feelings and emotions, which have been weaponized by those in the right. I imagine that transformative platform of change has a very strong foundation on these life worlds and on these drivers of these life worlds. On the second question for this round about how can progressive win or at least make this viable this time, I feel the pessimism with the assumption behind the question, but it is also something very real. And as what we would often say, we can only find solution if we recognize the problem. And in recognizing that problem, I think that in shaping our power agenda and in pursuing our change-making strategies, indeed, we have to recognize that there has to be a bigger vehicle for that. So social democracy perhaps can look towards transformative realism as a critical vehicle for our change-making. And hopefully, it will not just be about building bigger tents, but more fortified structures anchored on stronger basis of unities that cannot easily be washed away by, say, a wave of authoritarianism, a wave of populism, something that is more robust. And transformative realism, I think, has challenged us as progressives to look into that. So again, thank you, Marc. Thank you, Comrade Macris.
Thank you, Macris. I like what Sabina said much earlier, that we need a new agenda and we need to define what is our agenda in order to reach where to go, in order to know where to go and what to reach, and not just a transactional move. I would say that ultimately we should come back to look at individuals. I mean, Asia, particularly Malaysia, we have to deal with heterogeneity of in our society, and we have to deal with ethnicities and all other identities in our society. But I think ultimately we need to bring everyone back to the questions of us being human. For humanity, for citizenship. I mean, bringing back people back to the basic formation identity, that is citizenship in the society, and using that as a basis to build democracy, using that as a basis to build empathy and to build respect perhaps when Marc was talking about respect, maybe the word for Malaysia would be dignity. It's quite commonly used in our society, dignity. How do we move away from ethnicity and use the word of that used to be practiced in other sector, the word dignity for citizens, the word dignity for workers, for mothers, for women. Perhaps maybe we should think about that. But ultimately, we need to ask the questions of how the state will function, and how do we guide the state to function in our society, in a society that we desire. How do we structure the state, and what is the role of the state in the new Keynesian situation? Those are my comments. Thank you.
Let us now come to how transformative realism frames or puts this all together with your response.
Well, I mean, let's start with Sabina's point and Chin Tong's point that we need a new agenda, a new vision. And the realism part is always about looking what's happening, right? That's the starting point from everything. And what's happening is that we are seeing a revolution in the international political economy. It has a lot to do with the fight over hegemony between China and the US. So we will see that beyond the trade war and the tech war that's going on already, there will be a politicization of market access, infrastructure investment, and supply chains. So this free trade world of the last 40 years is coming to a close. I'm not talking about decoupling, I'm talking about diversification, but still it's quite a significant change. At the same time, we see the structural changes, old industries dying, new industries emerging is getting faster. The pressure onto that is getting bigger. And therefore, we see a speed up when it comes to automation, the replacement of humans by machines, structuring as well as reshoring of production facilities in the global economy. Why am I saying this? Because transformative realism has two main ideas here. Number one, we have to take all life worlds with us through these changes that are happening, and you will win an election. You will be able to shape this transformation if a lot of people believe that you will be the one who can actually shape this competently, but also in a socially balanced way. I will come back to that later when we tackle Percival's question about populism. The second message of transformative realism is that we always should be on the lookout for new allies. And I think the interesting fact is that at least in Germany, but I think I've seen similar signs in other countries as well, is that the economic and political elites have already understood that these changes are underway. And they are now finally embracing the idea that the status quo is no longer tenable. And that opens a lot of opportunities for a political refiguration, right? It will be possible to form new alliances that were not possible before. The main term for that, Chin Tong, I'm sure that is something that you can work with in Malaysia. I'm definitely sure that it's something that's needed in Thailand. I'm not so sure about the Philippines. You will have to think about that. The term for that is modernization. It's not democratization, it is modernization. You can build in very interesting political coalitions around that basically say, we have no longer the luxury to lag behind. We're actually falling behind with the old politics, and we need to leap forward into this new international political economy, and therefore all the forces that want modernization have to come together and break through the impasse. That actually allows you to form political coalition across political camps. How that is being done is, of course, complicated, and we do a lecture on that next when I talk about the German coalition and the election. The interesting thing is that what is this new vision, you know? And I think we are so much closer to seeing that now than we've only been 3 or 4 years ago. We do know that the social, ecological, and digital transformation is hegemonic now. No one questions that anymore. That is a victory that actually has been achieved. We know that there will be a more active and more investing and more steering role of the state. We know that this comes with new educational and welfare policies. And we know that it will come with a new economic paradigm, which is going to be neo-Keynesian, right? So we know a lot about this vision and this agenda, which we have not known only a few years ago. Second, the question that Sabina asked is, so, okay, the activists are on their own planet, and how do we bring them together? You know, it's like, how do we bring together labor activists and climate activists? And this is something that we have been very, very active also as FES trying to do that. I think that, you know, bringing together physically on the same table is already a great start, because all politics is local and personal, so people have to talk to each other. That was always this idea of these seed communities that I brought to the table. But there's also a theoretical and strategic, I think, intervention that needs to happen. I think if you talk to progressive activists around the world, right, they have a couple of things internalized. All of them understand what intersectionality is, and all of them understand what the multitude is, and all of them have these kind of bottom-up based ideas of politics that were promoted by Antonio Negri and so on. I believe that's all nonsense, and we have to replace that with a new strategic paradigm. I suggest one right here. So it's kind of the guiding thing that you have in the back of your head of how you tackle politics. That needs to change. And if that is, maybe it doesn't have to be spoken at the table, but, you know, basically, what is your political instinct, what you're trying to do? I think Percival really brought that that message home to say, what we want to do is to build an alliance that is so strong that we can break through the resistance to our agenda. That is an entirely new thinking. That's not a multitude that comes together on a street square and protests. That is not some activists that nibble around the fringes of the political field. That is actually going for the center and defeating the other side, but also trying to bring together as many people and co-opt them in order to move forward. It's a new kind of strategic thinking. I think that's needed. So Percival said, how can we actually bolden up this, that we're not so easily washed away by these waves of populism? And I would like to answer to that, that we have to maybe also understand clearer what actually causes these waves of populism and what we have to do with it if we want it or not. I think let's say the fertile ground on which populism actually can grow is that there is a vast feeling in many life worlds, in many segments of the society, that people feel threatened by different things. It can be by crime, but also by social decline. It can be by losing their jobs. They have the feeling that no one listens to them. They're not being represented by the political parties, but no one is also actually showing up at their doorstep. That's actually what won the German election. It's like really knocking on doors. So you need an army of volunteers to actually speak to people, because them being heard is the first step towards being taken seriously. We had a lot of people who were voting in East Germany for the right-wing populists, and they said, I do actually feel ashamed that I have to do that, but it's your fault because you were not there for a decade. You didn't come up, right? So it's an act of self-defense. I'm not trying to apologize that. I'm trying to understand political psychology. The third feeling is that whatever I do, I'm the little man. I can do nothing. It doesn't matter. You know, it's a problem. We need to find on the communal level, maybe through citizens councils, something like that, venues, opportunities where people can make change in their life world, in their own environment, that they can actually see, feel, and touch, so that they have the feeling they matter again, because the depoliticization of a lot of people has been the biggest problem for progressives all over the world. And the fourth element, and that's the most toxic one, is the feeling that the elites look down on me, look down on us, right? And that's not just the capitalist, old feudal elites, that's also, and that hurts, I'm so sorry, us, right? There is a feeling that the progressives are looking down on us because people don't speak the right language. People still eat meat. People still want to do a holiday and board an airplane, and they want to have a car. I'm sorry for that, right? And we're telling them they're evil, stupid, backwards, old white males or whatever. It is an attitude that pisses off people, and it needs to stop. So what is the counter to that? So how do you deal with this kind of politics? I think there needs to be a combination between, like I said, material security. You know, it's not just words that will heal the wounds. You have to provide social security, so people do not fall into a black hole. You have to provide public services everywhere. And you have to basically compensate people that are the losers of structural change in the industrial base. It has to be a political element, like I said, participation, being heard, representation, and also actually the opportunity to have venues and platforms on which you can become active and shape the things around you. The communal level here is extremely important. This is the first step towards politicalization of people, is actually the communal level, not the national level. And third, there is a cultural element, an emotional element that has to do with a sense of dignity. I like that very much, Chin Tong, what you said. Respect, a sense of belonging, a sense of what we means, and that I belong to that we, a collective identity, right? So there needs to be material, political, and well as emotional and cultural interventions in order to break this wave of populism. And that's not going to happen overnight. I mean, we have caused that problem over 30 years or 40 years, and we cannot snip our fingers, tell the people, oh, we have changed. You know, we're new now, you can trust us. It is really about credibility and re-earning the trust of the people. And I can only emphasize how important it is to knock on doors. People actually need new faces. That has to do with generational change. Of the new parliamentary faction of the SPD, out of 204 parliamentarians, 104 are elected for the first time, and 47 of them are under 40 years old. So new faces, fresh faces that can actually, you know, get a little bit of the load of the past off their shoulders and really talk to people and listen to them and take them seriously. That's the first step towards being taken seriously again. So it's a lot of, you know, conceptual work. I think that's what I'm trying to bring to the table with transformative realism, but it's also organizational work that has been done by the political parties that actually allow to bring real life people to this, that people can speak to and exchange their mind. That is also part of the puzzle.
Thank you, Marc Saxer, and thank you to our panel commentators. I see my chair emeritus Eta Rosales raising her hand, and I will lose my job if I will not call her. Let us have my chair emeritus. Thank you, Marc, for staying in. I'll have Eta Rosales. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Macris, for inviting me here. I found it very refreshing in the midst of the elections that we are preparing for. Marc, my question is simple. Akbayan wants to regain a party list that we had lost in the House of Representatives. a party list, and the number one nominee is Percy over there. My question derives from an earlier point. I was late, but I was able to catch some of your words where you said that you don't copy and paste one society to another. And it has to do much with the party list system in the Philippines. We copied and pasted the party list system in Germany, in Western Europe, and adapted it to the Philippines. But I said that the party list system, which is grounded on proportional representation, is effective in Europe because the entire parliamentary system is actually guided by proportional representation. And in the case of the Philippines, it is not. I am certain that you are probably aware of the situation in the Philippines. How do you look at that? Your comments.
Thank you, Ka Eta. Mark, any thoughts on the proportional representation system and how it can be a weakness or a strength in pulling coalitions together or a transformative alliance to jump from it?
I think that would be an entire new lecture now. And I think there's an entire political science scholarship around these questions. It's not going to help you much for the next election anyway, right? Because you're not going to change the system. I always like to compare also the situation of comrades in Asia with each other. And we have, of course, one of the alliance partners we have in SOCDEM is the Future Forward Party that has now been banned and reformed. And they wanted to go for constitutional reform as the first step when they entered the parliament. And I told them that is a terrible mistake. I thought it was an absolute terrible mistake. And it turned out that way, that this kind of street politics that it goes right to the center and then even goes to try to attack the monarchy out of a position of weakness. I think that's what always drives me mad, is that like we're so traumatized by the experiences that we have that we try to change everything at once. Doesn't matter how strong we are or weak we are, doesn't matter how strong or weak the opponent is, and just march right to the gates of the castle and get slaughtered. I think is a terrible strategy. I think speaking with Gramsci, it is a long battle, and you have to win a lot of. It's a long war, and you have to win a lot of battles, and you have to be exactly clear what hill you would like to attack next. I think the Constitution would be the very last that I would care for, because you will not win that anyway. So you waste your energy on something that you will definitely lose. I think at the end of the day, it's about building broad-based societal coalitions that are irresistible. And once you've done that, right, once you've built a political platform, then you can actually try to tackle things. My emphasis, and that also goes to Chin Tong, who knows that already, is like stay clear of identity politics. It's unwinnable. It's a losing battle, and try to focus as much as you can on bread and butter issues. So jobs, social security, public services, these are the kind of things that I would tackle first. These are winnable battles, but they're still hard, and you're still not strong enough to do it, right? So there's no way of foregoing the alliance building. Without the alliance building, nothing will happen, right? But once this allying is there, and I think Percival already reminded us how fragile that is, right? I would lead that new coalition towards a battle that you could possibly win. And that is, like I said, modernization and material bread and butter issues.
Wonderful to be discussing with you this afternoon. For you, Marc Saxer, I will wrap up the discussion with takeaways from your lecture. The transformation project through transformative realism stands on two legs. One is a life world platform, and on a transformative alliance. You gave us handles on analysis, theory, and practice. One is emphasis on material condition, but be appealing enough to appeal to the emotions and make it an irresistible project. Number two, we need people participation at the heart of the democratic process if we are to continue this pursuit of our power agenda. Number three, respect, and to add to Chin Tong's point, dignity as a call against polarization and unity. Number four, we mobilize social base around an alternative future. And number five, we need to reimagine in this neoliberal age the state and market dynamics. Through a Gardiner state, we offer modernity. We offer a nurturing and active state as against the old, the backward, the rotten. And transformative realism provides us with a strategic thinking towards transformation. On my last point, you just reminded us to be confident about our politics. It is what we do. Transformation is what we do. So for social democrats at this age, in the face of pandemic, let's continue transformation because it's what we do. Thank you for your time, Marc Saxer. And thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. This is Macris Cabreros from Manila. Keep safe and we will see you again soon. Mabuhay.